In 1742, workers had been walking over for centuries without knowing it was there. Nobody knows who built it, and so, nobody knows when. Nobody can agree on why. And that cave is not even the strangest thing hiding beneath Britain. There are thousands of underground passages across this island that historians still cannot explain. Tonight, we are going into them. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. And if you are new here, hit subscribe. Somewhere in the English countryside, if you could stand in the middle of a quiet field on a still night and press your ear to the earth, you might feel something that is hard to name. Not quite a sound, not quite a vibration, something older than that. The sheep don't notice it. The oak trees have simply grown around it for centuries. The hedgerows that divide the fields in their ancient patter. In 1742, workers, repairing a market, cross in a quiet English town, struck something unexpected beneath the stone. A sealed shaft. They lowered a candle and found walls covered in carvings. Hundreds of tropical figures, symbols nobody could explain. A chamber, the entire town Huns, run right past it without acknowledgement, and the villages nearby, with their pubs, and their Norman churches, and their war memorials, have spent generations walking over it without knowing quite what lies below. Britain is a country that carries its history on its face. The Roman walls, the ruined abbeys, the Iron Age hill forts that still rid the skylines of Wiltshire and Dorset. These things are visible, discussed, catalogued and open to the public on bank holidays. People bring their children to them and take photographs and read the little brown signs. What is on the surface feels knowable, even if the details are argued over. But Britain is also a country with an extraordinary amount of history that is not on the surface at all. Beneath the meadows, beneath the market squares, beneath the cathedral precincts, and the high streets and the housing estates built in the 1970s, over fields that had never been built on before, there is another landscape entirely. A landscape of tunnels, chambers, passages, and voids that stretches from the Cornish coast to the Scottish Highlands, and has been there in some cases for a very long time, longer in some cases than anyone can adequately explain. Some of these underground spaces are well understood: Victorian sewers, medieval wine cellars, and Georgian ice houses, wartime air raid shelters. These are documented, surveyed, and filed. But some of them are not understood at all. Some of them appear on no map and in no record, and lead nowhere. That makes practical sense. Some of them bear carvings that nobody has satisfactorily attributed to any known group of people. Some of them connect buildings that were built centuries apart. Some of them simply end in blank walls of carefully cut stone. And nobody knows whether what lies beyond that wall is more tunnel, or solid earth, or something else entirely. Now let's go down. Before we can begin to talk about specific tunnels and specific mysteries, it helps to understand how extensive this underground world actually is, because the scope of it tends to surprise people who have not looked into it before. Britain is a relatively small island by the standards of the world. You can drive from the southern coast of England to the northern tip of Scotland in a long day, under the right conditions, and the whole country could fit comfortably inside a single American state. And yet beneath that compact surface lies one of the most densely complicated underground landscapes on the Templar, built up in layers across 4,000 years of continuous human habitation. There are over 900 documented caves and man-made tunnels beneath the city of Nottingham alone. Not the county, the city. 900. And those are only the ones that have been found and recorded. Edinburgh has an entire hidden town beneath its streets. Not metaphorically, but literally. Name streets and closes and rooms that were sealed off and built over in the 18th century and rediscovered, much later, by accident. The chalk hills of southern England are riddled with passages cut so long ago that even the Comfrey lived above them in the medieval period, believed they were ancient. Cornwall has coastal tunnels that smugglers used enthusiastically in the 18th century. but which were clearly already old when the smugglers found them. Parts of London have underground passages that appear on no utility map, connect no known destinations, and have no documented origin. Historians, archaeologists, and the growing community of people who call themselves urban explorers in Wycombe have been cataloguing all of this for decades, and the picture that emerges is not tidy. It is layered and complicated and frequently maddening. Because Britain's underground did not develop according to any single plan. It accumulated. One civilization dug into the earth, and then another civilization dug into the same earth 1,000 years later, without always knowing the first civilization had been there, and then another after that. And the practical result is that you sometimes find a passage that begins in a style consistent with one era, continues through a section that looks entirely different, and then terminates in a chamber that belongs to a third period altogether. And the question of how those three sections relate to each other, whether they were built at the same time or centuries apart, can take decades of careful analysis to even partially answer. What we are going to do tonight is walk through the most compelling of these underground spaces, spending time with the ones that remain genuinely mysterious, even to specialists, even to people who have devoted significant portions of their careers to understanding them. We are going to be honest about what we know, what we think we know, and what remains in that uncomfortable middle space where the evidence points in several directions at once, and nobody wants to claim more certainty than the facts will support. And we will begin, as Britain's underground story begins, in the deep past. The oldest human-made underground spaces in Britain are not tunnels in the way we typically imagine tunnels. They are not passages designed to move people from one place to another in secrecy or convenience. They are holes, essentially, but holes of such deliberate precision, dug with such specific intent, and that they tell us something remarkable about the people who made them. Before we reach those holes, it is worth pausing for a moment on the landscape that surrounded them. The Britain of 4,000 years ago was not the open farmed hedge country that we see today. It was heavily forested, particularly in the lands with the uplands of the chalk downs and the limestone hills and the sandstone ridges, providing the more open country that early communities preferred for settlement and agriculture. The rivers were broader and more changeable than they are now, draining a wetter and less managed landscape. The sea levels were still adjusting to the end of the last ice age, and the population of the entire island was by any modern standard extraordinarily small. Estimates vary, but the Britain of the Neolithic period probably held somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 people spread across an island that today holds 67 million. What this means is that the underground spaces of this period were not the products of a dense, specialized urban civilization. They were the products of scattered communities of farmers and herders and hunters who had not yet developed the range of institutions and trades and written records that make later eras more legible to us. And yet, what those communities achieved underground was by any measure remarkable in Norfolk, in a landscape that feels almost impossibly flat and open compared to the dramatic uplands that most people picture when they imagine ancient Britain. There is a place called Grimes Graves. The name sounds medieval, Ballan, and the Norman connotation of grime, referring to a devil or a spirit, is probably deliberate on the part of the people who named it, because by the time the Normans arrived in the 11th century, the site had been abandoned for so long that nobody remembered what it was. What was visible on the surface was a series of roughly circular depressions in the earth, arranged across several acres of heath, as if something enormous had pushed down into the ground from below. The Normans looked at these unexplained holes and concluded, reasonably enough, given their world view, that they must be the work of something other than human. They were wrong, but only in the way that people are wrong when they underestimate what human beings are capable of without the technology we now consider normal. Grimes Graves is a Neolithic flint mine. I learn it was dug approximately 4,500 years ago, during the period when Britain was first developing the agricultural practices that would eventually, over centuries, transform the island from a forested hunting ground into the farmed landscape we recognize today, and flint was essential to that transformation. Flint makes tools. It makes scrapers and knives and arrowheads. It makes the sharp edges that allow you to work wood and leather and bone, and the flint that lies near the surface of the earth, exposed to frost and rain over long periods, is brittle and unreliable. But the flint, deeper in the ground, the flint that has been protected by layers of chalk and clay, is different. It is smooth and dark and almost glassy, and it knaps cleanly, meaning it breaks along predictable lines under the right kind of pressure. To the Neolithic toolmakers of eastern England, that deeper flint was worth the extraordinary effort of reaching it, and the effort was extraordinary. At Grimes Graves, archaeologists have identified over 400 individual mine shafts, each one dug by hand, using picks made from red deer antler, sinking through layers of chalk until they reached the good flint seam, sometimes 8 or 10 meters below the surface. When a shaft reached the flint layer, the miners did not simply pull out what they could reach from above. They dug horizontally into the chalk from the bottom of the shaft, following the flint seam outward in every direction, creating underground galleries that radiated from the base of each shaft like the spokes of a wheel. And then when one shaft was exhausted, and they filled it partly with the spoil from the next shaft being dug nearby and started again. This was organized. It required planning and coordination across multiple generations because the site was not used once and abandoned. It was worked continuously for perhaps 500 years by communities who must have understood the value of what they were doing, who must have passed the knowledge of how to find the good seam, how to follow it without the ceiling collapsing, how to work the stone once it was brought to the surface from one generation to the next with care. We do not have their names, we do not have their language, but when you climb down into one of the shafts that has been left open for visitors and crouch in the gallery at the bottom, running your hand along the smooth chalk walls where antler picks left their marks 4,000 years ago, the sense of human intention is overwhelming. These people knew exactly what they were doing. What happened at the bottom of those shafts, beyond the extraction of flint, remains a matter of careful scholarly debate. In one shaft, excavated in the early 20th century, archaeologists found a small chalk figurine of a woman, arranged carefully in a niche in the wall beside a chalk lamp and a collection of flint nodules that appeared to have been placed rather than simply discarded. Whether this represented a ritual offering, a propitious gesture before beginning work in a new gallery, a simple act of devotion to a deity associated with the earth, or with fertility, or something else entirely, is not clear. What is clear is that it was deliberate. Someone placed that figurine in that niche on purpose, and the fact that it was left there when the mine was eventually closed suggests it was not considered appropriate to remove it. This is the beginning of something that will recur throughout our entire journey through Britain's underground. The practical and the ritual exist together in these spaces. People who dug into the earth for entirely sensible economic reasons also seem to have understood those spaces as charged with meaning, as places where the boundary between the everyday world and something else was thinner than usual, as places where it was worth taking precautions or making gestures that acknowledged the strangeness of going down into the ground. Grimes Graves is the most extensively studied Neolithic mine site in Britain. But it is not the only one. Similar flint mining operations existed in Sussex, in Wiltshire, in areas of Wessex that were clearly connected through trade routes and cultural exchange to the communities of Norfolk. Gasps and beyond the flint mines, there is another category of Neolithic underground construction that is even harder to fully understand, and that is the souterrain. Souterrain is a French word meaning simply underground, and it refers to a specific type of structure found in Scotland, in Ireland, in Cornwall, and in Brittany across the Channel. Structures that share enough characteristics across their wide geographic spread to suggest they belong to a single tradition, even if the details vary from one region to another. They are underground chambers, typically stone-lined, typically cobbled or roofed with large flat slabs, are typically accessed through an entrance passage so low that you have to crouch or even crawl to get in. They are usually associated with Iron Age settlements dating roughly from the first millennium before the Common Era into the first few centuries of the Common Era, though some may be older, and their purpose is genuinely contested. The practical explanation for souterrains, and it is a reasonable one, is storage. Underground spaces maintain a relatively constant temperature year-round. In the days before refrigeration, an underground chamber was one of the best available places to store food through a warm summer or a hard winter. Dairy products, root vegetables, grain, smoked or salted meat, all of these would keep longer in a cool underground space than in any above-ground structure. The association of souterrains with settlements that kept livestock and practiced agriculture is consistent with this interpretation. But when you look at individual souterrains closely, problems with the pure storage explanation begin to appear. Some of them are very large, far larger than any storage need of the associated community would seem to require. Some of them have multiple chambers connected by deliberately narrow passages, so narrow that a person must squeeze through sideways, which would make moving quantities of stored goods in and out of them extremely awkward. Some of them have features, niches, deliberate drainage channels, small subsidiary chambers that seem designed for purposes other than simply stacking provisions. In Orkney, where the density of prehistoric monuments is so remarkable that the archipelago has its own UNESCO World Heritage designation, there are souterrain-like underground passages associated with the remarkable settlement at the Scarborough, which dates to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, making it broadly contemporary with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The passages at Scarborough connect the individual stone-built houses of the settlement to each other underground, so that the inhabitants could theoretically move between dwellings without ever going outside. In a climate where Akkadian winters drive horizontal sleet for months at a time, this makes obvious practical sense. But the passages also have a certain quality, a sense of deliberate and careful construction that goes beyond simple utility, and that makes scholars reluctant to explain them entirely in functional terms. Further south in Scotland, in Angus and Perth, and across the Highlands, there are hundreds of souterrains that remain not fully studied. Many were discovered only when agricultural machinery broke through into them during ploughing. Some have been mapped and documented, many have not. Local traditions around some of them are striking. In various parts of Scotland, underground passages of this type are referred to in folklore as Picts' houses, attributing them to the mysterious pre-Gaelic people of northern Scotland about whom history knows frustratingly little. Whether the souterrains were actually built by the historical Picts, by earlier Iron Age communities, or by several different groups across a long span of time, and depends very much on which site you are looking at and what the excavation record, if there is one, actually shows. What the Soutar ends have in common with Grimes graves and with most of the other underground spaces we will visit tonight is this quality of deliberate construction without a fully satisfying explanation. People clearly needed to build them. People clearly put significant effort and skill into building them, but the full picture of why they were built, what they meant to the people who built them, and what happened inside them, remains just out of reach, just below the threshold of what the available evidence can tell us with confidence. There is one further thing worth noting about the Sutter before we move on, and it is something that applies broadly to the study of prehistoric underground structures in Britain, but our ability to date them has improved significantly in recent decades, and the dates that have emerged from careful analysis of associated materials have sometimes been surprising. Several souterrains in Scotland that were assumed on the basis of their style and their terrain, inifacor association with certain settlement types to be Iron Age in date, have produced radiocarbon, dates suggesting construction significantly earlier than the dominant model would have predicted. Others have produced evidence of use across much longer periods than their construction date alone would suggest, meaning that a structure built in one era was still being used, maintained, or modified several centuries later by communities whose relationship to the original builders is not always clear. This problem of long use is a persistent one in the study of underground spaces, and a space that is built at one moment in time by one community can be used, reused, modified, extended, sealed, reopened, reinterpreted, and reused again across centuries or even millennia. Each use leaves traces, and the traces of different uses can overlap and obscure each other in ways that make the full sequence of use very difficult to establish. When we ask who built this tunnel, the honest answer sometimes has to be that the tunnel as it currently exists was built by several different groups at several different times, and that separating their contributions requires a level of physical investigation that has not yet been carried out. The Romans, when they arrived in Britain in the 1st century of the Common Era, brought their own underground traditions with them, and what they added to Britain's buried landscape was considerable. Rome's relationship with underground space was practical in a way that was almost breathtaking in its ambition. A civilization that built aqueducts, heated floors, public baths, and citywide sewer systems across an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria was not a civilization that was intimidated by the challenge of managing what lay beneath the ground. And in Britain, which Rome occupied for nearly 4 centuries before withdrawing in the early 5th century of the Common Era, the Romans left underground traces that are still being found. The most famous of these traces is perhaps the hypoc, the underfloor heating system that characterized by Roman buildings of any pretension. A hypoc works on a beautifully simple principle. The floor of a room is raised on small columns of tile or brick, creating a void beneath it, a furnace, and stoked continuously with wood. Heats air that then circulates through this void and rises through channels in the walls, warming the room above, from below, and from the sides simultaneously. It is an elegant solution to the problem of heating a stone building in a northern climate, and the Romans deployed it wherever they built with any degree of permanence in Britain. The remains of hypocs are found at Roman villa sites across England and Wales, at bath complexes, in places like Bath itself, and Roxton, and Uldra, and occasionally, in contexts that are less expected, beneath modern city centres, where later building has preserved the Roman layers by sealing them. In London, excavations associated with the construction of new buildings in the city have repeatedly broken through into Roman levels that include hypocore systems, still more, or less structurally intact. The tile columns, standing in their neat rows in the cool underground air, as if waiting for someone to light the furnace again. But the Romans also dug tunnels in Britain for less visible purposes. The extraction of lead, copper, gold, and iron was a major economic priority for Roman Britain, and mines required underground access. Lead mining in the Mendip Hills of Somerset began under Roman direction shortly after the conquest, and the Romans also worked lead deposits in Darbyshire, in Shropshire, and in Wales. Roman gold mining at Dolcethy, in Cadenshire in Wales, is one of the best studied examples, with evidence of open-cast workings and underground galleries following, or veins, and a sophisticated water management system, including aqueducts and layers for hydraulic mining. The underground workings at Dolcethy though modified by later use, still preserve sections that date to the Roman period, and the scale of the operation suggests a level of investment and organization that goes well beyond anything a small local enterprise could have managed. This was imperial industry. What is more intriguing, and considerably harder to document, is the question of what the Romans may have built underground for non-industrial purposes in Britain. There are persistent traditions, particularly in cities like Bath and York and St. Albans, all of them Roman foundations or significant Roman centers of underground passages that do not correspond to known Roman utility works in York, which the Romans called Aboracum, and which served as an important military base, and at one point as the seat of imperial power when the Emperor Septimius Severus died there in the year 2011. There have been reports for centuries of underground passages connecting various points in the city center. Some of these have been investigated and turn out to be medieval or later. Some of them remain unexplained. The difficulty with attributing any underground structure in a continuously occupied city to cities tend to reuse what they find. A Roman drain becomes the foundation for a Saxon building. A Saxon cellar gets deepened in the Norman period. A Norman passage gets extended in the 15th century and collapsed in the 19th and forgotten by the Roman used to 20th. The stratigraphic record, the layer-by-layer sequence that archaeologists use to date structures and objects, gets compressed and scrambled in ways that can take years of painstaking analysis to begin to untangle. And in many cases, that analysis never happens because the development pressure is too urgent and the archaeology gets removed without adequate recording. This is one of the genuinely maddening aspects of Britain's underground history. We know that significant things are down there. We know because when construction crews break through into unexpected voids, what they find is sometimes important enough to halt work and call the archaeologists. But for every unexpected find that gets properly investigated, there are probably several that get recorded hastily, photographed briefly, and then sealed again under new concrete, and the evidence preserved, but inaccessible, the story incomplete. After the Romans withdrew in the early 5th century, Britain entered a period that historians used to call the Dark Ages, and that designation, though now considered somewhat unfair and inaccurate, captures something true about the state of our written evidence. We have much less documentation of what happened in Britain in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries than we have for the Roman period or for the medieval period that follows. But underground construction did not stop. It simply changed character. It is worth noting, before we move into the medieval period proper, that the centuries between Rome's withdrawal and the consolidation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not entirely without underground activity. Communities throughout Britain maintained and in some cases extended the underground spaces they had inherited, used the collapsed remains of Roman structures as quarries and as ready-made cellars, and in several documented cases continued to use Roman drainage systems that had been functioning for generations. The institutional memory of how to dig and use underground space did not vanish with the legions. It persisted in the practices of communities who had learned from 4 centuries of Roman urban life. Even as the political and administrative structures that had organized that life dissolved, what changed was the scale. The large organized Roman infrastructure projects gave way to smaller, more local, more reactive approaches to the underground. But the impulse to go down, to use what lay beneath the surface, continued without interruption. By the time Britain had settled into the rhythms of medieval life, with its manors and monasteries and market towns, and the elaborate hierarchies of feudal obligation that tied peasant to lord and lord to king, the underground was already a layered landscape. Whatever the Romans had left, whatever the Iron Age and Bronze Age and Neolithic communities had created before them, was now simply part of the ground beneath people's feet, known about in some cases, forgotten in others, occasionally encountered when wells were dug or foundations laid, and variously explained as the work of Romans, of giants, of the devil, of the good people who were not to be named directly. Medieval underground construction in Britain falls into several broad categories that are relatively well understood, wrong, and then a further category that is considerably less so. The well-understood category includes the cellars and undercraft-ofts of medieval buildings, which survive in remarkable numbers beneath the market squares of English towns. An undercraft-oft is essentially a vaulted storage space beneath the ground floor of a significant building, and they were built because stone-vaulted underground spaces provided both the secure storage and the temperature control that a merchant's business required. Wine, spices, wool, salt, grain, all of these could be kept in better condition underground than above, and the heavy stone vault of a medieval undercraft also provided protection against fire, which was a constant and devastating threat in medieval towns built primarily of timber. Many of these medieval undercuffs survive in excellent condition beneath shops and restaurants in historic English city centres. Chester has some of the finest, Lincoln has remarkable examples, and Southwark in London has a concentration of medieval vaulted spaces that have been in more or less continuous use since the 13th century, most recently as wine, bars, and storage areas for restaurants. The less well-understood category is the tunnel, and here we must be careful, because the word tunnel in a medieval context carries a great deal of folklore baggage that makes it very difficult to separate what was physically real from what was imagined, embellished, or simply invented. The classic English medieval tunnel legend goes roughly like this. A church, abbey, or castle is connected by an underground passage to another church, or castle, or manor house, at some distance. The passage was used for escape, or for the convenient transit of monks between buildings, or for smuggling, or for secret meetings between parties whose association needed to be concealed. The passage has been blocked, is filled with rubble, is too dangerous to enter, but its existence is absolutely confirmed by the testimony of older residents who either entered it themselves as children or were told about it by someone who had. The passage is sometimes said to extend for a mile, or 2 miles, or 5 miles, and here, almost invariably, the evidence becomes thin. Archaeologists and historians who have spent time investigating these tunnel traditions in English towns have published cautious assessments that tend toward the same general conclusion. The human fondness for underground narrative, for the drama of secret passages connecting significant buildings across significant distances, is considerably stronger than the practical evidence for most of these passages actually existing. This does not mean that no medieval tunnels were ever dug. It means that the folk tradition of secret passages has been generously applied to every unexplained underground void, or blocked arch, or ventilation shaft in the country, and that the resulting map of supposed medieval tunnels is a substantial mix of the real and the duppy imagined. What does seem archaeologically supportable is that some monasteries and priories did have underground passages, particularly drainage channels, and the passages associated with riridoras, which is the rather elegant medieval term for latrines. The Benedictine rules of hygiene required running water, and the engineering required to deliver running water to monastic communities and then carry the waste away often necessitated underground channels of considerable sophistication. Some of these channels were large enough to walk through if you were willing, and they connect buildings within monastic complexes in ways that can look, if you encounter them without context, like deliberate secret passages. There are also genuine escape tunnels at a small number of fortified sites. The medieval castle or tower house that did not include at least some consideration of what its defenders would do if the outer walls were breached was not a well-designed castle, and a postern gate, a hidden exit through the walls, often had a short underground component. but these tend to be short and specific, designed to get defenders over the wall and into the booty. The tradition that connects abbeys to distant manor houses by underground passage is harder to support. It is a tradition that seems to owe as much to a general sense that monks were up to something they needed to conceal. A suspicion that was particularly energetically promoted during the Reformation, when the dissolution of the monasteries required a certain amount of retrospective vilification of monastic life as to any physical evidence of actual tunnels, which does not prevent people from believing it. And not all of those believers are wrong. Some of those passages are real. The challenge is working out which ones and why. And among all of the mysterious underground spaces in Britain, there is one that stands apart from the rest in its combination of genuine physical existence, extraordinary visual evidence, and almost complete historical obscurity. It is in a small market town in Hertfordshire, and it has puzzled everyone who has seriously examined it for over a century and a half. The town of Royston sits at the intersection of two ancient roads. One of them was already ancient in the Roman period, the Icknield Way, a prehistoric trackway that follows the chalk ridges of East Anglia, southwest toward Wiltshire, and the great stone monuments of Salisbury Plain. The other is Man Street, the Roman road that ran north from London toward York. The crossing point of these two old routes was a natural place for a settlement to develop. Ferrant and a settlement did develop probably in the early medieval period, and became the market town that still exists today. In 1742, a group of workmen were digging in the marketplace, attempting to excavate the earth beneath a millstone that had served as the base of a market cross, when their tools broke through into a void. They lowered a boy into the hole on a rope, and he reported that below the millstone there was a chamber. Further excavation revealed a narrow shaft, not quite wide enough for an adult to descend comfortably, that opened at the bottom into a circular room approximately 5.5 meters in diameter and approximately 5.5 meters deep, cut into the chalk. The chamber had a domed ceiling, for it had a small recess in the wall that contained traces of ash, and that appeared to have served as some kind of lamp or fire niche, and every surface of its walls was covered in carvings. The carvings at Royston Cave are among the most debated images in British archaeology. They cover the walls from roughly waist height to the ceiling in an elaborate arrangement of figures that is clearly not random. There are crosses, many of them of several different types. There are figures that appear to be saints or holy persons, some of them identifiable by their attributes. The wheel of St. Catherine, the arrows of St. Sebastian. There is a figure that has been interpreted as the Holy Trinity. Are hearts and hands, and geometric patterns that do not obviously correspond to any recognized iconographic tradition. And there are what appear to be shields bearing devices that scholars have tried with limited success to connect to historical families or organizations. The most persistent and the most dramatic interpretation of the Royston Cave carvings is that they were made by Knights Templar. The Knights of the Temple of Solomon were a military religious order founded in Jerusalem in the 12th century, given the task of protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, and growing over the following 2 centuries into one of the most powerful and wealthy institutions in Europe. They operated throughout England, and there was a Templar precept at a place called Baldock, not far from Royston. The Templars were also, as every schoolboy who has ever been entranced by conspiracy theories knows, she suppressed, with considerable brutality, in the early 14th century, arrested on charges of heresy and various other crimes that modern historians generally regard as largely fabricated for political and financial reasons, and eventually formally dissolved. The idea that the Royston Cave was some kind of Templar chapel or refuge carved by members of the order who used the intersection of the ancient roads as a waypoint on journeys between their English prectories is appealing. Some of the symbols in the cave do have parallels in Templar iconography. The crosses are of types associated with military religious orders. The overall atmosphere of the space, small, enclosed, clearly designed for some kind of devotional purpose, is consistent with what a private chapel or oratory might have felt like. But archaeologists and art historians who have examined the carvings carefully have not been able to confirm the Templar attribution with any confidence. The style of the carvings is not consistent with a single period of carving or with a single artistic tradition. Some of the figures appear to have been made at different times than others. Some are more accomplished than others in a way that suggests different hands or different menders, rather than a single program of decoration. Some of the iconographic elements are more consistent with general medieval Christian devotion than with anything specifically Templar, and crucially, there is absolutely no documentary record, no charter, no inventory, no account, no passing mention in any surviving medieval text of the cave at Royston existing, being used, or being made. In the absence of documentary evidence, does not prove the Templar theory wrong. The suppression of the Templars was precisely the kind of event that might lead to the careful removal of any record of places associated with them. If the cave was indeed a secret place of Templar devotion, then the people who knew about it would have had every reason after 1307 to ensure that no record of it survived. But the absence of evidence is still a problem for any argument that depends on it. Other theories have been proposed. The cave may have been a hermitage used by a religious recluse who spent years carving devotional images in the chalk as a form of meditation and prayer. Hermitages were not unusual features of the medieval landscape, and some hermits did occupy unusual or underground locations. The cave may have been associated with the Guild of the Holy Trinity that had a presence in Fort Royston during the medieval period. It may have been a place of pilgrimage connected to a specific local cult. It may have been carved over a long period by multiple different users who each added to the existing decoration. None of these theories has gathered decisive evidence in its support. The Royston Cave remains officially described in the careful language of archaeological understatement as a site of unknown origin and function dating to the medieval period. It is open to visitors, and if you have not been, it is worth the effort. You descend the narrow shaft and find yourself in the chalk chamber, and the carvings press in from every direction, and the light is low, and the silence is remarkable. And you understand immediately why generations of people have found this place impossible to dismiss. Something happened here. Someone cared enough about this space to spend an enormous amount of time in it, in the dark, cutting images into the chalk with deliberate intent. Who they were, and what they were doing, and why they chose this particular spot at the crossing of two ancient roads, nobody can tell you with certainty. That quality of determined unknowability is something Royston shares with a great many of Britain's underground spaces. But the next site we are going to spend time with is different in character. It is not ancient. Its origins are documented. It has a precise date of construction, and an identified builder, and a great deal of colorful history attached to it. And it remains mysterious in ways that its documented origin only partially accounts for. In the village of West Wycombe in Buckinghamshire, a few miles northwest of the market town of High Wycombe, there is a hill. The hill is crowned by a church dedicated to St. Lawrence, and beside the church there is a large spherical golden ball perched on the tower that serves as a kind of local landmark, visible from some distance across the Chiltern countryside. The hill also contains, cut into its chalk interior, a set of tunnels that extend for roughly a third of a mile in total length, and terminate in an underground chamber beneath the church, above, that is known, because of the dimensions that were deliberately chosen for it, as the Inner Temple. The tunnels were dug in the 1740s and 1750s by workers employed by Sir Francis Dashwood, and whose was at various points in his career a Member of Parliament, the Postmaster General, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and one of the most elaborately provocative characters of 18th-century English public life. Dashwood was a man who appears to have approached almost every social convention of his era with the specific intention of finding the most flamboyant possible way to violate it, and the underground complex he constructed at West Wycombe was in many respects his masterpiece of transgressive theatre. The official reason given for the tunnels at the time of their construction was employment. The 1740s were a period of significant hardship in the English countryside, and Dashwood represented the area in Parliament, providing work for local men by hiring them to dig chalk from the interior of the hill, which could then be spread on the roads, was presented as an act of local benevolence. And it is true that the chalk was indeed used on the roads, and it is true that the employment was indeed provided, but the shape that Dashwood chose for the tunnel system, the specific chambers he had carved out, and the way he had them arranged, makes clear that employment and road improvement were not the only things on his mind. The tunnels at West Wycombe are designed not in the way that a utility tunnel is designed, where the design serves the function. They are designed in the way that a theatrical set is designed, where the design creates an experience, where the sequence of spaces and the transitions between them are carefully calculated to produce particular effects on whoever moves through them. The passages lead through a series of chambers, some of them given names that are full of significance in the intellectual culture of the 18th century. A banqueting hall, a triangle room, a steward's room. The inner temple at the end of the complex is a circular chamber of carefully chosen proportions, and it sits directly beneath the chancel of the church above it, separated from the consecrated ground by a known thickness of chalk. This arrangement, an underground chamber of deliberate construction, positioned directly beneath a Christian church, was not accidental. It was the kind of gesture that Dashwood made, deliberately, ostentatiously, in full expectation that people would notice and be either delighted or appalled, depending on their temperament. It is because the tunnels at West Wycombe were the meeting place of the Hellfire Club. The Hellfire Club, properly called the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wycombe, or sometimes simply the Monks of Medmenham, after the ruined abbey on the Thames, where they initially met, was one of the most notorious private societies of the Georgian period. Its membership included some of the most prominent men in England, politicians, artists, writers, men who appear in the indexes of serious history books, and whose other activities are matters of record. What they got up to at their meetings, whether in the Abbey, at Medmenham, or later in the West Wycombe tunnels, is a matter of considerable historical uncertainty, heavily freighted with sensational rumor. The popular image of the Hellfire Club involves black masses orgies at the invocation of demonic forces and enough candle-lit debauchery to fill several Gothic novels. Some of this image comes from contemporary satire, some of it comes from the reminiscences of members who were not entirely reliable narrators, and some of it comes from later embellishment by people who found the story irresistible. What the historical evidence supports more modestly is a group of well-connected men who met for dinner and conversation and various forms of amusement, and who enjoyed performing a theatrical inversion of religious ceremony as a form of philosophical entertainment, consistent with the dearest and sometimes libertine intellectual currents of their era, which is to say, they probably did not actually worship the devil, but they almost certainly did some things that would have struck their contemporaries as profoundly inappropriate, and they did them in a space designed with great care to maximize the atmosphere of transgression. What makes the West Wycombe tunnels mysterious beyond their colorful history is this. When the Hellfire Club ceased its activities in the early 1760s, the tunnels were sealed. Dashwood died in 1781. The Dashwood family retained ownership of the hill and the tunnels remained sealed for nearly 2 centuries. When they were eventually opened for investigation in the 20th century, and subsequently for visitors, certain things about them were found to be puzzling. The levels of the tunnel system do not all connect in ways that the known plans would suggest. There appear to be sections of passage that have been blocked rather than simply left unfinished. Several early investigators reported sensing air movement in parts of the tunnel system where there is no obvious source of ventilation, which typically indicates either an unknown opening or an undiscovered section of passage. The chalk that fills some of the blocked sections has never been systematically excavated, and nobody is entirely sure what, if anything, lies behind the fills. Whether the West Wycombe tunnels contain unknown chambers, whether there is more to the complex than is currently accessible, is a question that the site's current owners, the National Trust, have not pursued aggressively. The tunnels as they stand are a significant visitor attraction, and the mystery they carry don't. That quality of dark theatrical history, combined with genuine uncertainty about their full extent, is part of what makes them compelling. Perhaps the unknown sections contain nothing remarkable. Perhaps they were simply blocked for structural reasons when parts of the tunnel became unstable. But the possibility that there is more down there, in the chalk beneath that carefully positioned church, beneath the golden ball that looks out across the Chilterns, is one that nobody has yet fully closed off. From the calculated eccentricity of Dashwood and his friends, we move to a set of tunnels that present a very different kind of mystery, one that involves not the drama of an identified eccentric, but the more fundamental puzzle of attribution. In southeast London, in the borough of Bromley, and in a suburb called Chislehurst that still retains enough green space to feel like it is on the edge of the city rather than buried in the filed-in wall. There are approximately 35 kilometers of tunnels cut into the chalk. This is a considerable length. 35 kilometers of underground passage, if you laid it end to end, would stretch from the center of London to well beyond its suburban fringe. These tunnels have been visited by millions of people. They served as an air raid shelter during the Second World War, housing over 15,000 people at their peak capacity. They were used for mushroom growing, for concerts, including performances by bands that were significant in the history of popular music, for guided tours, and for a sustained effort at historical understanding that has been going on for well over a century. And despite all of this attention, despite the fact that these tunnels have been mapped and walked and studied for generations, nobody is entirely certain who dug them or when. The tunnels at Chislehurst are divided according to a long-standing tradition into 3 sections. One section is described as Druid, one as Saxon, one as Roman. These attributions are not based on datable physical evidence. They are based on a combination of local tradition, the apparent stylistic differences between different sections of the tunnels, and the interpretation of certain features that various observers across the centuries have associated with one era or another. A circular chamber in the Druid section is identified as a sacrificial altar. A small alcove in another section is identified as a place of Christian worship. A stretch of wider, as more regularly cut passage is associated with Roman engineering practice. Archaeologists who have examined the Chislehurst caves have generally concluded that the fruitional tripartite division into Druid, Saxon, and Roman sections is not well supported by evidence. The style of chalk cutting throughout the tunnels is broadly similar, which might suggest that the majority of the tunnels were dug over a relatively limited period rather than across the enormous time span that the traditional attributions imply. The principal candidate period that has emerged from various assessments is the medieval era, with chalk quarrying for agricultural purposes, for lime burning, and for building material, providing the most straightforward practical explanation for the existence of such an extensive network. If the Chislehurst caves are essentially a medieval chalk quarry that was extended over a long period of use, then they are impressive primarily for their scale, rather than for any particular mystery about their origin. But this conclusion, sensible as it is, does not fully account for everything that observers have noticed about the caves over the years. The arrangement of the tunnels is not entirely consistent with a purely extractive function. A chalk quarry's tunnels tend to follow the most efficient pattern for removing material, which means following the chalk seam wherever it is richest and structurally sound enough to work. The Chislehurst tunnels in several places follow paths that do not obviously correspond to this kind of extractive logic, and they turn and double back and create spaces that are wider or taller than necessary for quarrying. Some sections appear to have been cut with a degree of finish, a smoothness and regularity of wall that goes beyond what a quarrying operation would typically require. There are also the carvings, not elaborate decorative schemes of the Royston Cave variety, but incised marks on the chalk walls, crosses, dates, initials, symbols that range from obviously medieval to obviously modern and everything in between. Sifting through these marks to identify which are genuinely early and which are the vagal contribution of the many thousands of visitors who passed through the tunnels in the 19th and 20th centuries has proved difficult. What the Chislehurst caves offer in the end, is a version of the mystery that is very common to British underground spaces. They are clearly real, they are clearly extensive, they were clearly made by human beings at some point in the past. Beyond that, the certainty runs out fairly quickly. The explanations that have been offered, the traditional Druid, Saxon, Roman attribution, and the more skeptical medieval quarrying interpretation, both have their difficulties, and neither has been established beyond reasonable scholarly doubt. The caves exist, who made them in their entirety, and why they are arranged as they are, and whether there is significance in any of the specific features that observers have identified over the years, remains genuinely open. If you visit Nottingham as a tourist, which many people do because it is a city with a great deal to offer, you will likely at some point be told that Nottingham has more caves per square mile than any other city in Europe. This claim is difficult to verify precisely, and it may involve a certain amount of civic pride in its formulation, but the underlying reality it points to is remarkable enough to stand without embellishment. Beneath Nottingham's city centre, cut into the sandstone on which the city is built, there are over 900 recorded caves and rock-cut spaces. These range in scale from small single-chamber spaces, clearly used as cellars or storage areas, to multi-room complexes that served as substantial underground dwellings. They range in date from the early medieval period, when the Anglo-Saxon town was first developing, to the 19th century, when some were still being expanded and used, and they range, in their current condition, from well-preserved and accessible to partially or completely collapsed, flooded, filled in, or buried beneath later construction. The sandstone of Nottingham, a reddish Triassic rock that formed the bedrock of the old city, is both the reason the caves exist and the reason they are so abundant. Sandstone is soft enough to cut with hand tools, and the early inhabitants of Nottingham discovered that cutting rooms and passages directly into the rock was an efficient and stable alternative to conventional construction. A rock-cut room requires no timber framing, no stone quarried and transported, no mortar. You simply cut it out of the cliff or the hillside, and you have a space with walls and floor and ceiling that will last indefinitely, as long as the rock above it remains structurally sound. The caves of Nottingham developed in layers that reflect the city's history. In the medieval period, rock-cut spaces beneath the houses and shops of the town served as storage, as tanneries, as maltings for brewing, as simple shelters. Some were extended over time, as successive owners found new uses for them. The famous Mortimer's Hole, a rock-cut passage at Nottingham Castle, is one of the best-known individual caves in the city, associated with the dramatic story of the 1330 coup, in which the young King Edward III, having reached his majority and determined to remove power from his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, led a group of supporters through a secret passage into the castle to arrest Mortimer. Whether the passage that exists today is the same one used in 1330 is debated. But a passage undeniably exists, and the story attached to it has been told for nearly 700 years. What is less well known, because it does not have a dramatic royal anecdote attached to it, is that, beneath and around Nottingham's Victorian city centre, there are extensive cave systems that were still in active residential use into the late 19th century. Rock-cut dwellings, meaning homes where people actually lived, rooms cut into the sandstone with hearths and sleeping platforms, and small windows facing outward onto courtyards, house significant numbers of Nottingham's poor population well into the period when the city was also building some of the most ambitious Victorian civic architecture in England. The caves in which people lived, often in terrible conditions of overcrowding and damp, were only cleared in a series of slum clearance operations through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and many of them were then sealed rather than demolished, which means they survive in reasonable condition beneath later construction. The ongoing process of finding previously unrecorded caves continues in Nottingham to the present day. Every significant construction project in the city centre has the potential to break through into previously unknown underground spaces, and the city's planning regulations now require archaeological assessment before excavation on most sites, precisely because of this. The Nottingham Cave Survey, a project that has been running for decades, has mapped hundreds of caves in detail and continues to discover new ones. The 900-plus figure is not the end of the count. It is a snapshot of where the count stands at a particular point in an ongoing process of discovery. What is intriguing about the Nottingham caves, beyond their sheer number, is the occasional discovery of caves that do not fit neatly into the pattern of domestic or industrial use that accounts for the majority. Caves with features that suggest ritual use, or with carvings that are not obviously decorative, or with layouts that do not correspond to any obvious practical function. These outliers are a small minority of the total, and they should not be allowed to overshadow the very clear and well-documented, mundane history of the caves as a whole. But they are there, and they serve as a reminder that even in a city where the underground story seems relatively well understood, there are still corners that resist easy explanation. Of all the cities in Britain that have significant underground histories, Edinburgh presents arguably the most dramatic case, not because the underground spaces are the oldest or the most extensive, but because the story of how they came to exist involves a specific historical event that can be dated, documented, and traced to a human decision of peculiar scope. The old town of Edinburgh, which clings to the rocky ridge that runs from Edinburgh Castle at the west end to the Palace of Holywood House at the east, developed in the medieval period as a dense vertical city. The ridge provided defensive advantages, and the pressure of housing a large population in a limited space on a narrow rocky spine produced a distinctive urban form. Buildings in Edinburgh grew upward rather than outward, reaching heights that astonished visitors from flatter and less constrained cities, and the streets and closes that ran down from the main spine, the Royal Mile, were lined with tall tenements that pressed close together and created a maze of narrow lanes in which enormous numbers of people lived in close proximity. In the late 18th century, Edinburgh's city fathers decided to build a new town. The old town was overcrowded, unsanitary, and increasingly seen as incompatible with the aspirations of a city that considered itself a centre of the Scottish Enlightenment. A plan was developed to build a rational, spacious Georgian new town on the land to the north of the old ridge, separated from it by a valley that would be bridged. One of the bridges that was built to connect the new development to the old was the South Bridge. It's completed in 1788. The South Bridge is an extraordinary piece of engineering. It consists of a single visible arch spanning the Cowgate below, but the bridge is actually supported by 19 arches, of which 18 are buried within the structure, the buildings that were constructed along the bridge almost immediately after it was finished. The vaults beneath those buildings, the spaces within the 19 arches, were intended to serve as commercial premises, workshops, and storage. For a period of about 30 years, they were used as such. Then they were sealed. The vaults were enclosed as the buildings above them expanded, became damp, became associated with the poorest and most desperate inhabitants of the city, and were eventually simply incorporated into the structure and forgotten about. For approximately 2 centuries, the South Bridge vaults were sealed below the busy commercial streets of Edinburgh's Old Town, occasionally rumoured about but not formally investigated. When they were rediscovered and opened in the 1980s, what the investigators found was a remarkable preservation of 18th and 19th century urban life. The vaults contained the remnants of the people and businesses that had occupied them before. They were sealed. Cobbler's tools, bottles, fragments of clothing, the kind of mundane material that disappears from archaeological sites, where it is exposed to the elements but survives in sealed underground spaces in extraordinary condition. The vaults also contained human remains, and both formal burials and the more disturbing evidence of bodies that had been disposed of in the vaults, in ways that suggest the spaces were being used outside the site and supervision of any civic authority. The vaults have become one of Edinburgh's most visited underground attractions, and they are genuinely atmospheric in the way that spaces built by people who lived and died in conditions of significant hardship tend to be atmospheric. But it is a different part of Edinburgh's underground, a few minutes' walk from the South Bridge vaults, that generates the most consistent sense of historical strangeness. Mary King's Clothes is a street, or rather what was a street, that runs down from the Royal Mile on the north side of the ridge. In the 17th century, it was a functioning close, a narrow lane lined with the tall buildings typical of Edinburgh's Old Town, housing a mixed community of merchants, craftspeople, and their families. In 1645, Edinburgh was struck by plague. Mary King's Close was affected, and the street was closed off, its residents either dying or being removed to a lazaretto, a quarantine facility outside the city walls. Whether the street was sealed with its sick residents still inside it, as Edinburgh folklore has claimed for centuries, is a matter that modern historians treat with great skepticism, and the evidence for a mass sealing of living plague victims is thin. What is more certainly true is that the buildings of the clothes were subsequently built over, incorporated into the foundations of a large administrative building constructed in the early 18th century, and the clothes itself became a series of underground rooms accessible only through the foundations of the building above. The rooms of Mary King's Clothes were not entirely unused after they were incorporated into the building above. They served as storage, as occasional shelter, as workrooms for various trades. But the accumulated traditions of the clothes, the stories of the plague, years, and the abandoned community created a powerful local mythology that has attached itself to the physical space and made it one of the more haunting underground experiences in Britain. Whether or not the historical events that the mythology describes happened exactly as described, walking through the low rooms of Mary King's Close, which have been accessible to guided tours since the early 2000s, produces an undeniable sense of the past pressing close. But beneath Edinburgh's underground tourism industry, beneath the well-documented stories of the South Bridge vaults and Mary King's Clothes, there are aspects of Edinburgh's underground geography that are less well understood. There are passages recorded in historical documents that have not been definitively located. There are voids detected by ground-penetrating radar beneath parts of the old town that have not been excavated. The full extent of what lies beneath Edinburgh's famous ridge is still not entirely mapped, and the process of understanding it continues. The coastline of southern England from Cornwall in the west to Kent in the east has a long history of smuggling that is now considered an almost charming aspect of local heritage. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, to before the modern customs and excise system reached its current level of effectiveness, the trade in contraband goods, brandy, tea, tobacco, silk, lace moved through the coastal communities of the south coast in enormous quantities. The men and women who organized and carried out this trade were not always the romantic figures that later depiction has made of them. Some of them were violent. Some of them were connected to organized criminal networks of considerable sophistication. But they were also, in many cases, simply people of limited options who had found a way to make a living in communities where the sea provided both opportunity and danger. The smuggling trade required hiding places. Large quantities of contraband arriving on a beach at night needed to be moved quickly and stored securely until it could be distributed inland. In coastal caves were ideal for this purpose. They were accessible from the sea, invisible from inland, and the chalk and limestone coasts of Kent and Sussex and Dorset contain natural cave systems that served the smugglers well. But some of the hiding places that the smuggling communities used were not natural. They were passages that the smugglers found already existing when they began looking for hiding places, passages that were clearly older than the smuggling trade by what seemed even to the 18th trade, which uses of them like a considerable margin. In Kent, at a place called King's Gate on the Isle of Thanet, there are caves in the chalk cliffs that were used extensively by smuggling gangs in the 18th century and that show evidence of human use going back considerably further. In the passages are cut in ways that suggest quarrying, but the quarrying does not follow the most efficient paths for chalk extraction. Some sections of the passages are finished to a degree of smoothness that goes beyond what a working quarry typically produces. Small niches in the walls are found at regular intervals that have no obvious quarrying function, but that are consistent with the placement of lights. In Cornwall, where the Atlantic coast provides both exceptional cliff geography and a long tradition of maritime activity that was never entirely legal, there are coastal passages, known to locals for generations, that appear on no quarrying record and have no documented nost. Some of these passages connect the beach level of a cove to an inland point at some elevation above, which is not the direction you would expect a chalk quarry to run, but is exactly the direction you would expect a passage designed to move goods from a landing point to a storage location well away from the shoreline. The difficulty with investigating smuggling-related tunnels is that their users had strong incentives to leave no records of them and to deny their existence to anyone who asked. A passage that appears in no documentary record, that is known only through local tradition and occasional physical discovery, might be an ancient structure repurposed by smugglers, or it might be a structure deliberately created by smugglers and subsequently denied. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires physical investigation of the passages themselves, dating of the chalk cutting techniques, analysis of the tool marks on the walls, val and access to passages that their current owners, when there are identifiable current owners, are often reluctant to provide. The most intriguing version of the smugglers and older tunnels question comes from the coastal areas of Sussex, where several investigations have found what appears to be chalk cutting in styles inconsistent with 18th century practice, in passages that the documentary record such as it is associates with the smuggling era. If these observations are correct, if the passages were already there when the smugglers began using them, the question of who made them and why immediately becomes pressing, and nobody has been able to answer it with confidence. The underground passages of exit present a mystery that is at first sight more modest than the strange carvings of Royston or the contested ages of Chislehurst, but which on closer examination turns out to be considerably more puzzling than it initially appears. Exit is a city of great antiquity. It was the Roman city of Isca Dumnorum, a significant town in the southwestern extremity of Roman Britain. The Romans built it substantially with a forum, a basilica, public baths, and a circuit of walls that still partially defines the city's historic core. After the Romans left, the city survived into the Saxon period and was established as one of the most important towns in southwestern England by the time of the Norman conquest. The medieval city grew rapidly, and, by the 13th and 14th centuries, Aix was a significant commercial and ecclesiastical centre, with a cathedral that is among the finest examples of Gothic architecture in England. And beneath this historic city, there are passages, not caves in the Nottingham sense, not the extensive chalk workings of Chislehurst, but a specific and unusual category of underground structure, roughly rectangular in section, built of dressed stone running beneath the streets at a depth that varies depending on the local topography. The passages were built in the medieval period, probably beginning in the 13th century, and are continuing to be extended and modified through the 14th and 15th centuries, and their documented purpose is water supply. Exit lies in a river valley, and the medieval city required a reliable supply of clean water for both domestic and commercial use. The passages were built to carry water from springs on the hillside northeast of the city into the city centre through a gravity-fed underground channel, one of the earliest and most elaborate municipal water supply systems in medieval England. This is well documented. The accounts of the construction of the water system survive in part. The route of the main water channel is known from archaeological investigation and historical record, and the passages which are open to visitors and form one of Exit's most interesting tourist attractions are clearly what they are described as being. They are medieval water supply tunnels, but there is a problem, or rather there are several problems depending on which section of the core Exit passages you are looking at. The first problem is that some sections of the passage network are larger than they need to be, for water supply purposes alone. The water channel within the passages runs along one side of the floor. The passage itself in these sections is tall enough for a person to stand upright, and wide enough for two people to pass each other. This is not what you would expect from a purely functional water supply tunnel, where the dimensions would be determined by the need to accommodate the pipe or channel and allow minimal maintenance access. It is what you would expect from a passage that was designed for human use as well as water conveyance. The second problem is that some sections of the passage network do not seem to connect to the water supply system in any obvious way. There are branches and extensions that run away from the main water channel in directions that do not lead toward any documented water source or any significant point of use. These sections have been interpreted in various ways as redundant sections of earlier exploration, while the route of the main channel was being determined as escape routes or access. Passages for maintenance workers as passages that served purposes that changed over time, and whose original function has been obscured by later modification. None of these interpretations has been decisively established. The third problem is more elusive. Several observers across the centuries, from antiquarians of the 16th and 17th centuries to modern investigators, have noted that certain features of the exit passages are not consistent with the medieval construction tradition that the documented parts of the system display. There are sections where the stonework is of a different type or style. There are joints and angles that do not match the rest of the construction. There are what appear to be blocked openings in the walls that are not accounted for in any known plan of the system. Whether these anomalies represent earlier construction incorporated into the medieval system, whether they indicate significant modifications made in periods other than the cult documented medieval phase, or whether they are simply the inevitable results of centuries of repair and adaptation to a working infrastructure, is a question that the most detailed archaeological investigation of the passages has not fully resolved. The exit passages are a peculiar kind of mystery, one where the basic story is well established and the anomalies are at the margins. But the margins matter because they are the places where what we think we know turns out to be less certain than it first appeared. The Second World War transformed Britain's relationship with its underground in ways that have not yet been fully documented. Between 1939 and 1945, the British government dug, commandeered, expanded, and modified an extraordinary number of underground facilities for a bewildering variety of purposes: command centers, communications hubs, storage facilities for weapons, documents, art, gold, and government records, and factories relocated underground to protect them from bombing. Hospitals, dormitories, railway tunnels converted to entirely new uses, chalk and limestone mines repurposed as storage facilities on a scale that had no peacetime precedent. The cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, now a museum, are the most famous example of this wartime underground, and they are genuinely remarkable. Winston Churchill directed the British war effort from below ground, and the complex that housed his operations is a well-preserved monument to a specific and dramatic period of history. But the cabinet war rooms are only the most visible part of a wartime underground that extended beneath London and indeed beneath much of the country in ways that are still not entirely mapped and still not entirely declassified. Beneath London, as the deepest tube tunnel sections were converted for wartime use. The tube station at Down Street in Mayfair, closed as a public station before the war, served as an emergency headquarters for the Railway Executive Committee and was used by Churchill and for members of the War Cabinet on at least one occasion. Brompton Road Tube Station was used as an anti-aircraft operations centre. Aldwych Station was used for storage, including the Elgin marbles from the British Museum and significant collections from the National Gallery. The deep-level shelter beneath Bells Park Tube Station provided accommodation for displaced civilians in numbers that seem extraordinary by any peacetime standard. This is documented. These uses are on the record available in the National Archives, described in published histories of the wartime period, but the wartime underground also includes facilities that are less thoroughly documented, facilities whose records remain classified or have been lost or were never created in the form that historians typically rely on. Dover, which sat on the front line of the war, in a very particular and direct sense, as the coastal point closest to occupied France, has an underground history that is particularly layered. Doe Castle stands on the white cliffs above the town, a medieval structure of enormous size that was successively adapted for military use across many centuries. During the Napoleonic Wars, tunnels were dug into the chalk beneath the castle to provide barracks for troops, creating an underground garrison capability that did not require surface construction vulnerable to French bombardment. During the Second World War, these Napoleonic tunnels were expanded dramatically, with new levels and new connections adding to the existing network until the facility housed a significant command and communications operation. It was from the tunnels of Dover Castle that Admiral Ramsay coordinated Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of over 300,000 Allied troops from the beaches of Dunkirk in 1940. The tunnels of Dover Castle that are open to visitors today are extensive and impressive, but they are not the entirety of what was built there. The wartime facility included levels that are currently not open to the public, sections of tunnel that were sealed after the war ended and that have not been systematically surveyed since. Investigations carried out at various points since the war's end and have found in the sealed sections on the accumulated material of a wartime headquarters, equipment, documents, personal effects left in place when the facility was decommissioned, as if the people using it had expected to return and simply never did. Dover Castle is not unique in this respect. Across Britain, wartime underground facilities that were sealed at the end of the war remain sealed, some because they are structurally unsound, some because the cost of investigation has not been prioritized, and some because the information they might yield remain subject to restrictions that were designed for a different era and have never been lifted. There is a particular category of wartime underground construction that generates a specific kind of mystery, and that is the regional seat of government network built in the late 1940s and 1950s as part of Britain's Cold War civil defense preparations. As the nuclear threat became the defining strategic reality of the post-war world, the British government began preparing for the possibility of a nuclear strike by identifying and adapting underground facilities that could serve as government headquarters in the event that the main centers of government were destroyed. These regional seats of government, sometimes called rock bunkers or regional war rooms, were built or adapted across the country and were for obvious reasons not publicly acknowledged. During the period of their construction and operation, some of these facilities have been identified and are now in various states of preservation. The Burlington site in Wiltshire, a former Bathstone quarry adapted for Cold War use, is one of the most extensive, capable of housing 4,000 people underground for an extended period following a nuclear strike. It remained in operational readiness into the late 20th century and is now studied and occasionally opened for public visits. But Burlington is the known example. The question of whether there are equivalents that remain unidentified, facilities built using methods designed to leave no visible surface trace, is one that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. We have been moving through underground Britain with a general sense of direction, from the prehistoric to the modern, from the well-understood to the increasingly obscure, and now we arrive at the category that is hardest to describe and most resistant to explanation, and the tunnels and underground chambers that simply do not fit, that have no clear function, no identifiable builder, no obvious era, and that remain on the wrong side of the line between what we know and what we can only gesture toward. In Shropshire, in the town of Bridgenorth, a series of caves and passages cut into the red sandstone of the riverside cliffs have been known for centuries. Some of them were used as dwellings into the 19th century, some as storage, some as stabling for horses. The town has a documented history of cave use that is not in itself mysterious. But there are sections of passage in the Bridge North Cliff that do not connect to any of the documented cave dwellings that lead through the sandstone to points inside the cliff that have no access from the inhabited sections and no obvious exit to the exterior. When these blind sections have been investigated, what has been found is consistent construction, smooth walls, features suggesting deliberate use, and absolutely no documentary or physical evidence that allows them to be dated or attributed to any particular group or purpose. In Somerset, in the Menip Hills, where the Romans dug for lead, and where natural cave systems honeycomb the limestone in ways that are still being discovered by cavers, there are man-made passages that appear in the interstices of the natural cave network in ways that do not correspond to any documented mining operation. These passages are not marked on the records of the Roman lead mining operations. They are not consistent in their style with the techniques used by later medieval miners who worked to the same hills. They appear to be man-made, and they lead in directions that have not yet been followed to their ends, and nobody knows who made them. In Yorkshire, on the edge of the North York Moors, there is a concentration of underground structures known as the Bender Abbey passages that have been a subject of low-level scholarly puzzlement for decades. Band Abbey was a significant Cistercian foundation of the 12th century, and like most major monastic houses, it had underground facilities associated with its drainage and water management. These are not mysterious, but there are passages in the vicinity of Band, not directly connected to the abbey buildings, cut into the hillside at orientations that do not correspond to drainage requirements, and that emerge in locations that would have been outside the monastic precinct. Whether these passages predate the abbey, whether they were used by the monastic community for purposes that go unrecorded, or whether they have a connection to the natural features of the landscape that has not yet been recognized, is an open question. In Lincolnshire, beneath the town of Stamford, which is one of the best preserved medieval townscapes in England, there are passages cut into the limestone that connect what were in the medieval period some of the most important ecclesiastical buildings in the region. Some of these connections make straightforward sense in terms of what we know about the medieval establishments concerned. Others connect points where no documentary record explains why an underground connection would have been needed or desired. The passages are real, the connections they establish are real, and the purpose of some of those connections remains undocumented. The pattern that repeats through all of these examples is the same. Passages that clearly exist, passages that show evidence of deliberate construction, passages that lead somewhere, because passages without destinations were very expensive to make, and people in the medieval and early modern periods did not waste expensive effort on purposeless construction. And yet passages whose destinations, whose purposes, whose builders remain unknown. Part of the explanation for this pervasive unknowability is the documentary record, or rather, its absence. Literacy in Britain was widespread by the 18th century, but far less so in earlier periods. Many activities that were entirely routine and well understood by the people engaged in them left no written record, simply because the people involved did not write things down or wrote things on materials that have not survived, or wrote things that were lost in the fires, floods, and clearances that have reduced the medieval documentary record to a fraction of what was originally created. But the documentary silence around some of these passages is too complete to be explained entirely by the general losses of the historical record. A major underground construction project involves many people, leaves traces in the landscape, and tends to generate mentions in surrounding documents, in estate accounts, in church records, in the surveys and legal documents that were created around property boundaries. The passages that generate the deepest mystery are the ones that appear in none of these sources, that have left no trace in any surviving document, that are known only from their physical existence and from the accumulated local traditions, often vague and contradictory, that have gathered around them. There is a class of possible explanation for some of these tunnels that is worth considering, not because it resolves the mystery, but because it shifts its character. Some of what we see in Britain's mysterious underground may reflect traditions of underground space use that were not connected to any single institution, religious order, or civic authority, but that were maintained by communities and families across generations as private knowledge. In the same way that certain families maintained particular craft skills or particular medical knowledge that never entered the formal recorded tradition, it is possible that the knowledge of specific underground spaces was kept private, passed from person to person without being written down, used for purposes that the people who used them had no interest in publicizing, and eventually lost when the particular family or community that held the knowledge died out or dispersed. This kind of private knowledge is almost impossible to recover through historical research because its defining characteristic is that it was not recorded, but the physical spaces it left behind are still there, still waiting to be adequately explained. There is a particular quality that the most deeply mysterious of Britain's underground spaces share, and it is worth pausing to describe it before we move on, because it is easy to miss if you are looking for dramatic revelation rather than for the quieter strangers that is actually there. The quality is this. These spaces are ordinary in their physicality. The chalk is chalk. The sandstone is sandstone. The dressed stone is the dressed stone of whoever cut and laid it. There is no glow, no supernatural atmosphere, nothing that would strike you as immediately otherworldly if you encountered it in another context, and yet the spaces feel significant in a way that exceeds their physical dimensions. A small circular room cut into the chalk 800 years ago, covered in carvings that nobody has satisfactorily explained, is not grand, it is not enormous. By any objective measure, it is a modest thing. But standing in it, looking at those carved figures pressing in from every wall, you feel the weight of all the explanations that have been offered and found inadequate, all the theories that have arrived and departed without closing the question, all the generations of people who descended that shaft and stood where you are standing and understood that something had happened here without being able to say what. That feeling is not mysticism. It is the specific sensation of being confronted with evidence that you cannot fully interpret. It is what you feel when you read a letter in a language you mostly, but not entirely, understand. When you can get the general sense, and even many of the specific words, but something essential about the meaning keeps slipping away. Britain's mysterious tunnels are like that when they are written in a language that we can read, imperfectly at best, and the parts we cannot read are not random or peripheral. They are precisely the parts that would answer the most important questions. Why here? Why this depth? Why this shape? Why this direction? Why these carvings and not others? Why no record? The questions cluster around the physical evidence like shadows, and the physical evidence sits there in the chalk and the sandstone, solid and real, and entirely unable to speak for itself. What keeps investigators returning to these spaces? What keeps the scholarly literature on British underground mysteries alive, and occasionally producing new insights, despite the fundamental difficulty of the subject, is this. Every now and then, something is found that genuinely advances understanding. A new inscription is read. A dating technique is applied that was not available before. A document is found in an archive that makes a reference to a specific underground space that can now be identified with a known physical site. A comparison between tool marks at one site and tool marks at another suggests a connection between communities that nobody had previously identified. These advances are usually small. They are rarely the dramatic revelations that the popular imagination expects from mysterious tunnels, but they are real, and they accumulate, and over decades of careful work, the picture does become, in some respects, slightly less obscure. The process is slow, because the subject is difficult. And the subject is difficult, not because the people who study it lack intelligence or diligence, but because the evidence is genuinely limited and genuinely ambiguous. Working with incomplete evidence is the normal condition of historical inquiry. But in most areas of historical inquiry, there is at least a documentary framework, however sparse, that gives the material evidence a context in which it can be interpreted. With many of Britain's mysterious tunnels, even that sparse documentary framework is absent, and the material evidence has to do all the work unaided. There are several regional tunnel systems in Britain that deserve attention precisely because they have not attracted the same level of popular interest as the Royston Cave or the Hellfire caves, and their relative obscurity means that in many cases the investigation they have received is thinner than the questions they raise would warrant. In Cumbria, in the market town of Penrith, there are passages cut into the sandstone beneath the medieval town that were known to local residents for generations before they began to attract outside attention. The passages in this case do not come with the kind of elaborate mythology that clings to the Royston Cave or the Wycombe tunnels. They were simply there, occasionally broken into during building works, occasionally explored by local people who found their way into them through cellars or collapsed sections of ground, and then sealed again, and mostly forgotten. When a more systematic investigation of some sections was carried out in the late 20th century, what emerged was a network of passages that connected points in the medieval town centre in ways that the known above-ground layout of the town does not adequately explain. Some of the connections suggest routes between significant medieval buildings. Others lead toward the town's edge in directions that could represent escape routes, access tunnels for the movement of goods, or something else entirely that the investigators were not able to determine. What makes the Penry passages particularly interesting is their geology. The red sandstone of the Eden Valley in Cumbria is like the sandstone of Nottingham, a relatively soft rock that cuts cleanly with the hand tools available in the medieval and early to modern periods. But unlike Nottingham, where the extensive use of sandstone for rock-cut dwellings is very well has documented, and provides a clear context for understanding the underground spaces, Shem Penry does not have an equivalent tradition of documented rock-cut use that would make the passages immediately interpretable. They exist in a context where the above-ground history is well known, but the underground history is far less so, which makes them harder rather than easier to explain. In Wales, there are a number of sites where underground construction from various periods raises questions that the available evidence cannot fully resolve. The castles of Edward I, built in the late 13th century as instruments of the conquest and control of Wales, are among the best documented military structures in the medieval world, and yet several of them have an underground features that do not appear in any surviving building account and cannot be confidently dated to any particular phase of the castle's construction. Caerphilly Castle, which is probably the most architecturally ambitious of the Edwardian castles and which has been intensively studied, has passages within its walls whose full extent and purpose has not been mapped with the precision that the above-ground structure has been documented. Harley Castle has similar, unresolved underground features. Whether these represent construction details that simply did not make it into the accounts that survive, or whether they represent phases of construction or modification that are genuinely unrecorded, is a question that the available evidence leaves open. In the north of England, more broadly, there are dozens of sites where underground spaces, associated with monastic foundations, with fortified houses with market towns remain incompletely understood, and the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s and 1540s produced a wholesale disruption of the documentary traditions of hundreds of religious houses, and the records that survived in many cases represent only a fraction of what existed. This means that monastic underground construction, which was often substantial and technically sophisticated, sometimes survives in physical form, while the documentation that would explain it has not. You can stand in a vaulted passage beneath the ruins of a Yorkshire abbey and know with confidence that it was built by the monastic community that occupied the site, while remaining entirely unable to determine when it was built, exactly what it was used for, or why it leads in the direction it does, rather than some other. The cumulative weight of all these regional puzzles are all these sites where the physical evidence is real and the explanation is incomplete, is significant. They remind us that the underground mysteries of Britain are not confined to a small number of famous sites that have become tourist attractions and scholarly preoccupations. They are distributed across the country, present in counties and towns and landscapes that have never attracted the sustained investigation that would be needed to answer the questions they raise. The famous sites are famous in part because they were found and investigated at moments when the cases in the investigating had enough resources and enough interest to produce records that survived. Many other sites were found and not investigated, or investigated briefly and then sealed, or simply never found at all. In 1999, during construction work for a new shopping development in Gloucester, workers broke through into a medieval undercroft that had been sealed for centuries. The undercroft turned out to be connected to a series of passages that ran beneath a significant portion of the city centre, connecting points that had no documented underground connection. Several of the passages were clearly of medieval date. Some sections were older. The project was delayed while archaeologists recorded the find, and the passages were then sealed again beneath the new development. In 2014 in Norwich, engineers investigating the stability of a car park discovered that the ground beneath it was honeycombed with chalk-cut passages that had not appeared on any survey. The passages were mapped. AIM found to include chambers that had been used for purposes that the physical evidence did not make entirely clear, and subsequently sealed and monitored for structural stability. In 2017, ground-penetrating radar survey of a field in Wiltshire, conducted as part of a study of the landscape around an unrelated scheduled monument, revealed a network of underground passages extending across several acres that had no surface expression and no documentary trace. The survey revealed the passages in sufficient detail to determine that they were not natural features. Subsequent targeted excavation confirmed that they were man-made, cut into the chalk, and produced a material dating to the late Iron Age or early Roman period. The full extent of the network has not been excavated. These discoveries are not exceptional. They are representative of a pace of underground discovery that has been more or less continuous across Britain for as long as people have been digging foundations and laying pipes and surveying landscapes with modern tools. The list of significant underground discoveries made in Britain in any given decade would fill a substantial document of its own. They range from the dramatic, a previously unknown section of Roman road found perfectly preserved beneath a motorway extension, to the quietly significant, a chalk-cut well in a Sussex garden that turned out to be Neolithic in date and to contain votive deposits of remarkable integration. What all of these discoveries share is the implication that the underground landscape of Britain is very considerably richer than the surface landscape would suggest, and that the process of understanding it is nowhere near complete. We have been digging into British soil in a systematic and recorded way for perhaps 2 centuries in the best investigated areas and considerably less in others. We have modern tools that allow us to see beneath the ground without digging: ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, LIA survey that can reveal buried features from aerial perspective. But these tools are not yet deployed across the whole of Britain in a comprehensive way. They are used where there is a specific reason to look, where a development project triggers an archaeological requirement, where a researcher has a hypothesis to test, where a known site suggests adjacent features worth investigating. The implication of all of this is that there is a great deal still down there, and not just a few isolated pockets, but a systemic underrepresentation of Britain's underground heritage in any existing map or inventory. The 900 caves beneath Nottingham may not be the final count. The 35 kilometres of Chislehurst may have connections that have not been found. The passages beneath Exeter may continue in directions that have not been followed, and beneath the fields and market squares of hundreds of towns and villages that have never seen a systematic archaeological underground survey, there may be spaces that would, if they were found and properly investigated, change our understanding of particular periods or particular practices in ways that we cannot yet anticipate. The historian's relationship with this situation is, as historians' relationships tend to be, one of disciplined uncertainty. What we know about Britain's underground is significant and in many places genuinely remarkable. What we do not know is, by any honest measure, considerably larger. There is a question that sometimes surfaces when people spend time with Britain's underground mysteries, and it is worth addressing directly before we begin to wind down for the night. The question is why it matters. What difference does it make, practically speaking, that we do not know who cut the Royston Cave, or why the Chislehurst passages are arranged as they are, or what lies in the sealed sections of wartime tunnels? Part of the answer is simply the practical value of historical knowledge in its own right. Understanding how past communities organized themselves, what they valued, how they related to the physical landscape they inhabited, is not merely academic. It informs our understanding of where we come from and why we are as we are. The traces of past practice that survive in the physical world are the evidence from which that understanding is constructed. And every time we fail to record or investigate a piece of physical evidence because it seemed too obscure or too inconvenient, we lose something irreplaceable. Consider what the discovery and proper investigation of the Royston Cave added to our knowledge of medieval devotional practice. Even though the cave has not been fully explained, the evidence it provides for a tradition of underground sacred space in a secular location at the crossing of two major ancient roads. Eru tells us something about how medieval people related to specific kinds of landscape and to the idea of holy space that we would not have known if the cave had been found and immediately sealed. Every site that is investigated adds a piece, however small, to a picture that is always incomplete, but that becomes, through the accumulation of small pieces, gradually more detailed and more useful. There is also the question of what the unexplained underground spaces of Britain tell us about the nature of history itself. We tend as a culture to imagine the past as something that has been concluded, sorted, filed, and made available for reference. The further back you go, the more the past seems to recede into a kind of settled distance, where the major facts are known, and the remaining questions are matters of specialist interest only. Britain's mysterious tunnels refuse this comfortable narrative. They insist that the past is not finished, that the earth beneath an island that has been inhabited for 12,000 years still contains things that have not been found, things that have been found but not understood, things that were understood once and then forgotten so completely that the understanding cannot be recovered. That insistence is valuable. It keeps the relationship with the past honest. But there is another part of the answer that is harder to articulate but no less real. Britain's underground mysteries matter because they constitute a persistent reminder that the past is not finished, that the story of this island, which seems in many respects so thoroughly known, so densely documented, and so picked over by generations of antiquarians and historians and archaeologists, is still incomplete in ways that are not trivial, that beneath the thoroughly mapped and signposted surface of a country that has been continuously inhabited for 12,000 years, there are still spaces that nobody has entered in living memory, still carved things that nobody has adequately explained, still passages that lead somewhere we have not found yet. This is not a failure of knowledge, it is the natural condition of knowledge about the past, which is always partial, always in process, always capable of being surprised by what the earth gives back. The Royston Cave was beneath the marketplace for centuries, before the millstone was moved, and the boy was lowered on the rope. The South Bridge vaults were beneath Edinburgh for 2 centuries before anyone went back to look at them. The passages beneath the Wiltshire field were beneath the field for 2,000 years before the radar survey picks them up. What is down there in all the British ground that has not yet been surveyed is not knowable in advance. It may include things that would fundamentally alter specific parts of our historical understanding. It may include things that confirm what we already believe. It may include things that resist all our existing categories and force us to develop new ones. The uncertainty is the point. The mystery is not a gap in our knowledge waiting to be filled. It is an invitation to keep looking, to remain curious, to understand that the world contains more than any inventory can capture. And if there is something comforting in that, if it is reassuring to know that even the small and thoroughly inhabited island of Britain has not yet yielded all its secrets, then take that comfort. The world is larger underground than it appears from the surface. History is deeper than any account of it can fully reach. The past persists in the chalk, and the sandstone, and the limestone, in forms that we have not yet found, and in forms that we have found but cannot yet read. That persistence is not threatening. It is simply the nature of things that were made by people who had their own reasons, and their own reasons, and their own sense of what mattered. Reasons and knowledge and sense that we are still slowly trying to recover. You have spent some time tonight in the dark, not in a way that should have disturbed your rest, but in a way that I hope has carried you somewhere interesting, down through the layers of a small island that has been home to human beings for longer than the mind comfortably handles, and that carries in the chalk and sandstone and limestone beneath its fields and its streets, a version of its own history that is still being read. We walked through the Neolithic mines of Norfolk, where people cut into the earth 4,500 years ago with tools made from deer antler, and understood, in whatever way they understood such things, that they were entering a space where the practical and the sacred came together. We moved through the subterraneans of Scotland and Cornwall, those stone-lined underground chambers that served purposes we can identify in outline, but not in full detail, that represented some relationship between a community and the earth beneath it, that we can sense but not fully articulate. We visited the Royston Cave with its extraordinary carved walls, its committees of scholars and enthusiasts circling the same insoluble questions across the decades, its combination of vivid physical presence and almost complete historical silence. We walked through the theatrical darkness of the Hellfire caves, feeling the calculated transgression that Dashwood built into every turn of the passage, wondering what the sealed sections might reveal, if anyone ever opened them fully. We stood in the chalk of Chislehurst, and wondered whether the traditional divisions of Druid, Saxon, and Roman mean anything at all, or whether they are simply the best stories available to fill a genuinely empty space in the record. And we descended into the 900 caves of Nottingham and the hidden streets of Edinburgh, and walked the water passages of Exat, with their anomalies and their blocked openings, and thought about the wartime underground that Britain built in such urgency, and has never fully disclosed. And we spent time with the tunnels that simply make no sense, that resist all our tools of explanation, that are there, and are human-made, and are pointed at some purpose or some destination that we cannot identify. All of this is still down there under the sheep and the oak trees and the hedgerows and the Norman churches and the Victorian housing estates and the supermarkets and the roundabouts, patient in the chalk and the sandstone and the limestone, waiting with the particular patience of things that do not experience waiting as an inconvenience. If you are in Britain tonight, you are not far from something underground that nobody has fully explained. That is not a frightening thought. It is a satisfying one. It means that the island has more to offer than its surfaces have revealed, that the story is not over, that the next discovery might be made by someone digging a foundation for a garden extension, or walking a field with a metal detector after rain, or simply noticing that the ground sounds different when you tap it in a particular place. And if you are somewhere else tonight, then Britain's tunnels are one example of something that is true of almost every piece of inhabited earth. The ground beneath you has been used by people who are gone, shaped by hands and tools that have not been accounted for, marked in ways that are not yet known. And the underground is everywhere a richer place than any surface map suggests. You can let all of that settle now, the chalk chambers and the sandstone passages and the sealed wartime doors and the carved walls of the Royston Cave. Let them soften into the background of wherever you are, whatever the hour is. The dig is over for tonight. The passages are quiet. The carved figures on the Royston walls are still there in the dark. The same figures they were in whatever century someone pressed a chisel to the chalk and made them. If the kind of slow journey through buried history that we have taken tonight helps you find your way to sleep, there are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever you want them. And if you feel moved to share where you are listening from tonight, I would genuinely like to know. A town in Scotland, a cottage in the Chilterns, somewhere on the other side of the world where Britain's underground seems even more remote and therefore perhaps even more interesting. The comments are there, and I read them, but for now, the earth is quiet above the passages. The light that the medieval carvers worked by is long extinguished. Whatever the Hellfire Club did in their chalk chambers is centuries in the past. The water table moves through the limestone in the dark, and the slow geological rhythms of the island continue beneath everything that has ever been built on it. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. Let the underground be underground, and let the dark be comfortable and still. From the chalk beneath the English fields, from the sealed vaults of Edinburgh, I'm from the sandstone passages that nobody has entered in living memory, from all the layers of a buried island, still working out what it contains. Good night. Sleep well,